Lately I've been spending quite a bit of time printing or just thinking about prints for our home, new prints to sell, or just practicing the art of printing to archive my best work. And this in turn got me reminiscing about the Woodland Sanctuary exhibition last year. And then I realised it's been 1 year since the opening of what was a very special event. So while I was looking back, I came across some footage which was never published at the time, and it seems a real shame not to share it now. So please sit back and enjoy the next 18 minutes of Joe and I discussing our printed work and offering some insights into how we think, how we feel and pursue the art of photography. And please stay tuned for a special offer on the Woodland Sanctuary book to help celebrate its anniversary. So the Edge of Trees theme, one of my favourite themes as well, because like you, we absolutely love old trees and seeing things that have lived through centuries. This print of yours, it looks like 2 trees, doesn't it? But it is actually 1, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And that's got to be, what, 5?
I'd say so.
Yeah.
500-600 years old. Yeah. It's called Time as a Healer, which I must admit is a title stolen from elsewhere. Famous track of Eva Cassidy, I think, and it's which I love. But anyway, more to the point, you look at this tree, you can see that it has had many injuries over time, probably disease as well, but it's still flourishing, still producing leaves, still mopping up carbon, I should say, you know, which is all good, isn't it? But the heartwood has been split over time, and you know, you can imagine that in the center of this tree, there's lots of rotting, decaying material, which is providing a life for many invisible creatures and microbes and so on. Yeah. And that is part of what this theme is about, but it's also too the contrast between the really ancient trees and the trees at different ages in the woods. So we can see these silver birch, I think they are, maybe downy birch, but in the background here, which would be typically, looking at the size, I would guess 40, 50 years, maybe even not that old. In the foreground, more birch saplings starting to appear.
Rowan creeping in there.
There is, absolutely. In fact, you get quite confused if you look at these leaves here. You might think this is a rowan, but it is not. So yeah, this is a theme that we're really fascinated to tackle, and the whole title of The Age of Trees opens up an entire kind of book of different ideas.
You know, I've never treated trees just as subjects in the frame, but as characters, as life forces of things to be respected. And as we start to, particularly with ancient trees, and we start to get to learn about the ecological significance of them and the life forms which they help to support and harbour, it's an amazing, fascinating world which just blows my mind a little bit. So, you know, these where we start to get the hollowing in the ancient trees as well. One of the best tools that we can take into the woods is curiosity, you know, as lovers of nature, just to look a little bit closer, prod things, investigate, look in these holes, see what's happening. And then through that process of getting to know how these trees came to be and what actually makes an ancient tree, what that involves, and all the kind of dependent life cycles through that process as well. It's another, well, we're often told to slow down as photographers. You know, I think that's probably incredibly important in woodland when we're trying to make sense of complexity. But actually investigating, being curious, spending time with these, learning about these ancient trees, it just teaches you to spend even more time with it. And then through that process, we probably spot some really interesting details that we might not have done if we just viewed it as a tree, as a subject in the frame.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, I think the ecology of woodland is just endlessly fascinating. It's a lifetime of study for sure, many lifetimes probably. And you'll continue to keep discovering things. And of course, while our primary focus has to be the kind of visual phenomena that we see, I think that having that sense of curiosity and learning, constant learning about the processes only enriches the experience for us, for sure. I mean, I feel I know very little still, but the science of of these trees is amazing. A couple of thoughts before we finish on this is that it's sometimes said by scientists that one 500-year-old tree is worth 1,000 100-year-old trees, in terms of biodiversity, which is in itself an amazing thought. And then the other, finally, is that if this tree is in a reasonable assumption around 500 years old, then it was a young tree while the Tudors were on the throne. I mean, imagine what's happened since then.
When you think of what they've witnessed, there's got to be so many stories. Well, if only we could listen, but I guess we do our best to kind of, does sometimes feel like a conversation between us and the trees, because it all comes down to empathy, doesn't it? And an important part of having empathy and care for these is to learn about them. And then through the process, maybe they do kind of whisper to us, you know, what they deserve, you know, and how they deserve to be representative in a photograph.
Yeah, I think on a kind of spiritual level, that is definitely true. Well, one of the things that is fascinating to think of too is that the UK as a landscape has been so heavily managed, and woodland has been essentially industrially exploited for hundreds of years now, and because charcoal burning and that sort of woodland management has been a positive for human beings. But it does mean that ancient trees are relatively rare, because they've been, many have been felled, or they've been treated in such a way as made it impossible for them to prosper. So actually, I think you're thinking of future generations, it's really, really important where ancient trees do survive, that they're allowed to survive as long as possible.
This is a favourite image of mine, delighted to see it printed in the exhibition space here. Interestingly, for me, it was really kind of gives a sense of sanctuary in terms of my experience of the woods, but aesthetically it probably doesn't really sit within the sanctuary theme, so it's ended up in the age of trees. So I have my own feelings towards it, but it's also important to kind of disconnect ourselves from the images sometimes, and I'd be extremely interested to hear your interpretation of it.
I think this is one of your greatest pictures, if I can put it that way. I think it works on so many different levels. First of all, the lighting is absolutely exquisite. I know, we know as photographers that that's always a certain amount of luck, but involved in that. But you have to be there to experience it and to respond to it, and you've done that brilliantly here. I think that it represents a number of different elements that are worth discussing. Firstly, it's largely plantation wood, and yet it's a place of great beauty, and that's something that's kind of slightly confronting for us, because I think we tend to think, well, really beautiful woodland is ancient woodland with broadleaf trees, but this is a beautiful, beautiful space. And it does have a tranquility to it, and a sort of feeling of sanctuary. The birch, the fallen birch on the left, very old birch, I would say, for a birch, probably a good 150 years old, is the key component, because it also represents symbolically the fallen, the way that life cycles continue through the wood, as they inevitably do. And these days we would like to think that more trees are allowed to rot down in place in woods. Of course, that doesn't happen a lot of the time. They are swept up and cleared up and cleaned away, and because these are also working environments. But the symbolism of that is powerful, and this central, it looks like a Scots pine actually, I'm not sure if it is, but it's separate from the others. The way that occupies that space is extraordinary. That is this sort of a piece of luck, a piece of history that it happens to be separated from the others. But the way that it works in that space is just absolutely superb. And then finally, what elevates this image to another level is the spider's webs. Which you can see them in the foreground, but essentially they presumably would cover the ground throughout that area. That's a certain time of year when that happens, and it's just the evidence that reminds us that actually unseen through all the understory are tens of thousands of little creatures making a living. As it happens, the spiders leave their webs, but there's lots of other creatures that they're trying to catch to eat, and so there's this unseen life, which that is a little window onto, and that's what makes it really, really special.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. And those webs, actually, there's an area where you can just see them through here as well, little patches through here, and further up to the left, it's unbelievable what's revealed on a damp morning. Just a whole new world, and it does. It completely alters your perspective on what you're actually walking through and how important the understory is, and how rich an understory is when you're dealing with ancient areas of woodland as well. And it's funny enough, even though this is largely commercial now, it's also an area of scientific interest because of some of the old pine, and there's some very, very old pine trees there, and I think that history there is what's given this richness to the understory. It's a mass of bilberry, ferns and other things, and lots of life dependent upon that. It is a perfect fit for the age of trees, you know, the fallen, the very old, the very young and the more mature plantation. So it is a really good fit.
And it's just brilliant from a purely aesthetic point of view. So it's a great achievement.
So we've got two prints here, this was an incredibly productive day. I guess it shows the advantage of really getting to know these locations intimately, because I'd been waiting for some more magical conditions at this location, and these two images were from the same day, along with about 4 or 5 others as well. So really, really fantastic morning. But I'd love to hear what you think about these.
Oh, first is I'm really jealous that you're able to be in this beautiful woodland on a day like this. But the two of them work incredibly well together, actually, because I think you get this feeling of there's both kind of common structural theme, but differences in emphasis, and the way that you've cropped both. And I'm assuming that they are cropped a little bit top and bottom, perhaps.
Yes, 16:9, yes.
Is designed to emphasize this gentle rhythm that moves in the case of the top one, you know, from bottom left up through to middle right, and slightly the opposite with this lovely lying branch here. And in each case, what it does for me is to emphasize the idea of relationships in the wood, the relationship between trees, and the way that they can be interpreted. Once again, you know, if you were to break these images down analytically, you would see that although the superficial impression is that the twigs are very chaotic, as they also are given lots of detail, but the structural elements are incredibly carefully mapped out across each image. And you know, having shared time with you in these places, I know just how much care you take in exactly where you position the tripod and the camera in order to sort of distill that feeling that everything is just right. And you know, it's not an accident that you arrive in these particular places and they look just right. It's a lot of hard work. But the great thing about all that work is that it's fulfilled in the way that the print is made, you know, in the way that the color and the light all work together, and that you end up with something that works, as it were, in formal terms. So, i.e. the composition is pleasing, it's balanced, the space is just really interesting, especially in this one where it drops away here and you get this glimpse of the trees beyond. But actually the main protagonists have this sort of fascinating kind of relationship together, which you can interpret different ways. You've obviously given them titles which might be a guide to your own interpretation,
yes,
but clearly others might feel differently.
Exactly, yeah. No, that's fantastic. Very generous thoughts there. But for me as well, it's when it comes to this 16:9 crop, or any crop that I choose, it isn't just about, it's not just a practical choice, is it? It's not, you know, just coming up with the boundary which fits, you know, shape into it. It's part of the emotion of the image, our intended message for the image. The success of that is heavily determined, I think, by the aspect ratio that we choose. But it also comes back to the theme, the title of this theme, All the Woods are Stage. So it's that 16:9 cinematic aspect ratio, inspired by film again, which just fit. I mean, this one, for anyone that's interested, is called Arguments. And you can see there's definitely some sort of conversation going on here and a fantastic relationship between these trees. I saw it as arguments, particularly with this one falling at the bottom. A very different feeling to this one here, which I love this kind of window through to this main feature tree here, which kind of highlights the strength of showing the wider context, because it'd be very easy just to hone in and just photograph that tree, but actually showing a little bit more highlights the individuality of that tree, but also the fact that it just leans out above. We can't see the beck, but we can imagine there's a source of water down there, and the way that just sort of catches that early morning misty light.
Yes, exactly. And these different players on this stage, you know, you talked about the film. I'm thinking of others who might relate to theatre, seeing it's like a proscenium arch with these different characters strutting their stuff. There's so many different ways of interpreting it, and there's a wonderful depth to both of them, but particularly this one. I think that's a really interesting point, though, about trees as individuals. I mean, if we think of Krampus, which we were talking about earlier, that image is very focused on one in an open area of moorland, whereas the key element is to be able to build this sense of relationship in the wood, where trees both, and we know now, don't we, that they are dependent on each other, and that healthy trees tend to prosper for longer and grow older when they're in the woods, rather than being isolated by land management practices and so forth. Those isolated trees, yes, they can live, but trees generally do better when they're together, and they are like family, like community, and they argue just like family and communities do. So I think, yeah, there's that sense that, from an artistic point of view, that theme of the trees living and almost as a working together is a really one that will never end, I think.
Yeah, and as woodland photographers, I think it's nice to just see ourselves as just guests in that community.
Yes, exactly. It's nice to feel part of it, isn't it? I think, you know, you were saying how many times you'd have been to this particular spot before, knowing what to expect and having already perhaps dreamed up the images in your mind's eye, and then to come back and that familiarity, almost as if you're greeting old friends. Whether you feel, some days you will really feel part of it, and some days you're more of an onlooker. But I mean, yeah, it's that relationship too. Yeah,
and I must admit, there are times when I go to my favourite tree, such as this one, and I walk in and actually say, "Hello, how are you doing today?" Maybe I've spent a little bit too much time alone in the woods. I hope you enjoyed what was definitely the last footage from the show. I know we'll certainly find value in looking back at it from time to time. So as I said, there are still some copies of the Woodland Sanctuary book available, and to celebrate its 1-year anniversary and my birthday as well, I've reduced the price to £20 for the next 2 weeks. And I've kept the postage to a minimum as well, so please head over to my website to check that out, where you'll also find copies of Gathering Time, of course. But thank you ever so much for watching this episode, and I hope to see you again very soon.